Chapter 8. Constant Capital and Variable Capital. The various factors of the labor process play different parts in forming the value of the product. The worker adds fresh value to the material of his labor by expending on it a given amount of additional labor, no matter what the specific content, purpose, and technical character of that labor may be. On the other hand, the values of the means of production used up in the process are preserved and present themselves afresh as constituent parts of the value of the product. The values of the cotton and the spindle, for instance, reappear again in the value of the yarn. The value of the means of production is therefore preserved by being transferred to the product. This transfer takes place during the conversion of those means into a product, in other words, during the labor process. It is mediated through labor. But how is this done? The worker does not perform two pieces of work simultaneously, one in order to add value to the cotton, the other in order to preserve the value of the means of production, or what amounts to the same thing, to transfer to the yarn as product the value of the cotton on which he works, and part of the value of the spindle with which he works. But by the very act of adding new value, he preserves their former values. Since, however, the addition of new value to the material of his labor and the preservation of its former value are two entirely distinct results, it is plain that this twofold nature of the result can be explained only by the twofold nature of his labor. It must at the same time create value through one of its properties and preserve or transfer value through another. Now, how does every worker add fresh labor and therefore fresh value? Evidently only by working productively in a particular way. The spinner adds labor time by spinning, the weaver by weaving, the smith by forging. But although these operations add labor as such, and therefore new values, it is only through the agency of labor directed to a particular purpose, by the means of spinning, the weaving, and the forging respectively, that the means of production, the cotton and the spindle, the yarn and the loom, and the iron and the anvil, become constituent elements of the product, of a new use value. The old form of the use value disappears, but it is taken up again in a new form of use value. We saw, when we were considering the process of creating value, that if a use value is effectively consumed in the production of a new use value, the quantity of labor expended to produce the article which has been consumed forms a part of the quantity of labor necessary to produce the new use value. This portion is therefore labor transferred from the means of production to the new product. Hence, the worker preserves the values of the already consumed means of production, or transfers them to the product as portions of its value, not by virtue of his additional labor as such, but by virtue of the particular useful character of that labor, by virtue of its specific productive form. Therefore, insofar as labor is productive activity, directed to a particular purpose, insofar as it is spinning, weaving, or forging, etc., it raises the means of production from the dead merely by entering into contact with them, infuses them with life so that they become factors of the labor process, and combines with them to form new products. If the specific productive labor of the worker were not spinning, he could not convert the cotton into yarn, and therefore he could not transfer the values of the cotton and spindle to the yarn. Suppose the same worker were to change his trade to that of a joiner. He would still, by a day's labor, add value to the material he has worked on. We see, therefore, that the addition of new value takes place not by virtue of his labor being spinning in particular, or joinery in particular, but because it is labor in general. Abstract social labor, and we see also that the value added is of a certain definite amount, not because his labor has a particular useful content, but because it lasts for a definite length of time. On the one hand, it is by virtue of its general character, as expenditure of human labor power in the abstract, that spinning adds new value to the values of the cotton and the spindle. And on the other hand, it is by virtue of its special character, as a concrete, useful process, that the same labor of spinning both transfers the values of the means of production to the product and preserves them in the product. Hence, a twofold result emerges within the same period of time. By the simple addition of a certain quantity of labor, new value is added, and by the quality of this added labor, the original value of the means of production are preserved in the product. This twofold effect, resulting from the twofold character of the labor, appears quite plainly in numerous phenomena. Let us assume that some invention enables the spinner to spin as much cotton in 6 hours as he was able to spin before in 36 hours. His labor is now 6 times as effective as it was, considered as useful productive activity directed to a given purpose. The product of 6 hours' labor has increased 6-fold, from 6 pounds to 36 pounds. But now, the 36 pounds of cotton absorb only the same amount of labor as did the 6 pounds formerly. 1/6 as much new labor is absorbed by each pound of cotton, and consequently the value added by the labor to each pound is only 1/6 of what it formerly was. On the other hand, in the product, the 36 pounds of yarn, the value transferred from the cotton is 6 times great as it was before. The value of the raw material preserved and transferred to the product by 6 hours of spinning is 6 times great as it was before, although the new value added by the labor of the spinner to each pound of the very same raw material is 1/6 of what it was formerly. This shows that the two properties of labor, by virtue of which it is enabled in one case to preserve value and in the other case to create value within the same indivisible process, are different in their very essence. On the one hand, the longer the time necessary to spin a given weight of cotton into yarn, the greater amount of fresh value added to the cotton. But on the other hand, the greater the weight of the cotton spun in a given time, the greater is the value preserved by being transferred from it to the product. Let us now assume that the productivity of the spinner's labor, instead of varying, remains constant, that he therefore requires the same time as he formerly did to convert 1 pound of cotton into yarn, but that the exchange value of the cotton varies, either by rising to 6 times its former value or by falling to 1/6 of that value. In both of these cases, the spinner puts the same quantity of labor into a pound of cotton, and therefore adds as much value as he did before the change in value. He also produces a given weight of yarn in the same time as he did before. Nevertheless, the value he transfers from the cotton to the yarn is either 6 times what it was before, or in the second case, 1/6 as much. The same result occurs when the value of the instruments of labor rises or falls, while their usefulness in the labor process remains unaltered. Again, if the technical conditions of the spinning process remain unchanged, and no change of value takes place in the means of production, the spinner continues to consume in equal working times equal quantities of raw material, and equal quantities of machinery of unvarying value. The value preserved in the product is directly proportional to the new value added to the product. In 2 weeks, the spinner adds twice as much labor, and therefore twice as much value as in 1 week, and during the same time he consumes twice as much material, and wears out twice as much machinery, or double the value in each case. He therefore preserves, in the product of 2 weeks, twice as much value as in the product of 1 week. As long as the conditions of production remain the same, the more value the worker adds by fresh labor, the more value he transfers and preserves. However, this does not happen because he adds new value, but because the addition of new value takes place under unvaried conditions which are independent of his own labor. Of course, it may be said, in a relative sense, that the worker always preserves old value in proportion to the added quantity of new value. Whether the value of cotton rises from 1 shilling to 2 shillings, or falls to 6pence, the worker invariably preserves in the product of 1 hour only half as much value as he preserves in 2 hours. Similarly, if the productivity of his own labor rises or falls, he will, in the course of 1 hour, spin either more or less cotton than he did before, and will consequently preserve more or less of the value of the cotton in the product of 1 hour. But all the same, he will preserve twice as much value by 2 hours' labor as he will by 1. Value exists only in use values, in things, if we leave aside its purely symbolic representation in tokens. Man himself, viewed merely as the physical existence of labor power, is a natural object, a thing, although a living conscious thing, and the labor is the physical manifestation of that power. If, therefore, an article loses its use value, it also loses its value. The reason why means of production do not lose their value at the same time as they lose their use value is because they lose in the labor process the original form of their use value only to assume in the product the form of a new use value. But however important it may be to value that it should have some use value to exist in, it is still a matter of complete indifference what particular object serves that purpose. We saw this when dealing with the metamorphosis of commodities. Hence, it follows that in the labor process, the means of production transfer their value to the product only insofar as they lose their exchange value along with their independent use value. They only give up to the product the value they themselves lose as means of production. But in this respect, the objective factors of the labor process do not all behave in the same way. The coal burnt under the boiler vanishes without leaving a trace, so too the oil in which the axles of wheels are greased. Dyestuffs and other auxiliary substances also vanish, but reappear in the properties of the product. The raw material forms the substance of the product, but only after it has undergone a change in its form. Hence, raw material and auxiliary substances lose the independent form with which they entered into the labor process. It is otherwise with the actual instruments of labor. Tools, machines, factory buildings, and containers are only of use in the labor process as long as they keep their original shape, and are ready each morning to enter into it in the same form. And just as during their lifetime, that is to say during the labor process, they retain their shape independently of the product, so too after their death. The mortal remains of machines, tools, workshops, etc. always continue to lead an existence distinct from that of the product they help to turn out. If we now consider the case of any instrument of labor during the whole period of its service, from the day of its entry into the workshop to the day of its banishment to the lumber room, we find that during this period, its use value has been completely consumed, and therefore its exchange value completely transferred to the product. For instance, if a spinning machine lasts for 10 years, it is plain that during that working period, its total value is gradually transferred to the product of the 10 years. The lifetime of an instrument of labor is thus spent in the repetition of a greater or lesser number of similar operations. The instrument suffers the same fate as the man. Every day brings a man 24 hours nearer to his grave, although no one can tell accurately merely by looking at a man how many days he has still to travel on that road. This difficulty, however, does not prevent life insurance companies from using the theory of averages to draw very accurate, and what's more, very profitable conclusions about the length of a man's life. So it is with the instruments of labor. It is known by experience how long, on the average, a machine of a particular kind will last. Suppose its use value in the labor process lasts only 6 days. It then loses, on average, 1/6 of its use value every day, and therefore parts with 1/6 of its value to each day's product. The deterioration of all instruments, their daily loss of use value, and the corresponding quantity of value they part with to the product are accordingly calculated on this basis. It is thus strikingly clear that means of production never transfer more value to the product than they themselves lose during the labor process by the destruction of their own use value. If an instrument of production has no value to lose, i.e., if it is not the product of human labor, it transfers no value to the product. It helps to create use value without contributing to the formation of exchange value. This is true of all those means of production supplied by nature without human assistance, such as land, wind, water, metals in the form of ore, and timber in virgin forests. Here, we are confronted with another interesting phenomenon. Suppose a machine is worth 1,000 pounds and wears out in 1,000 days. Then every day 1/1000th of the value of the machine is transferred to the day's product. At the same time, the machine as a whole continues to take part in the labor process, though with diminishing vitality. Thus it appears that one factor of the labor process, a means of production, continually enters as a whole into that process, while it only enters in parts into the valorization process. The distinction between the labor process and the valorization process is reflected here in their objective factors, in that one and the same means of production, in one and the same process of production, counts in its totality as an element of the labor process, but only piece by piece as an element in the creation of value. On the other hand, a means of production may enter as a whole into the valorization process, although it only enters piece by piece into the labor process. Suppose that in spinning cotton, the waste for every 115 pounds used amounts to 15 pounds, which is converted not into yarn but into devil's dust. Now, although this amount of waste is normal and inevitable under average conditions of spinning, the value of the 15 pounds of cotton is just as surely transferred to the value of the yarn as is the value of the 100 pounds that form the substance of the yarn. The use value of 15 pounds of cotton must vanish into dust before 100 pounds of yarn can be made. The destruction of this cotton is therefore a necessary condition for the production of the yarn, and because it is a necessary condition, and for no other reason, the value of that cotton is transferred to the product. The same holds good for every kind of refuse resulting from a labor process, where that refuse cannot be further employed as a means in the production of new and independent use values. Such an employment can be seen in the large machine-building factories at Manchester, where mountains of iron turnings are carted away to the foundry in the evening, only to reappear the next morning in the workshops as solid masses of iron. We have seen that the means of production transfer value to the new product only when, during the labor process, they lose value, in the shape of their old use value. The maximum loss of value the means of production can suffer in the process is plainly limited by the amount of the original value with which they entered into it, or in other words, by the labor time required to produce them. Therefore, the means of production can never add more value to the product than they themselves possess independently of the process in which they assist. However useful a given kind of raw material or a machine or other means of production may be, even if it costs 150 pounds or say 500 days of labor, it cannot, under any circumstances, add more than 150 pounds to the value of the product. Its value is determined not by the labor process into which it enters as a means of production, but by that out of which it has issued as a product. In the labor process, it serves only as a use value, a thing with useful properties, and cannot therefore transfer any value to the product unless it possessed value before its entry to the process. While productive labor is changing the means of production into constituent elements of a new product, their value undergoes a metempsychosis. It deserts the consumed body to occupy the newly created one. But this transmigration takes place, as it were, behind the back of the actual labor in progress. The worker is unable to add new labor to create new value without, at the same time, preserving old values, because the labor he adds must be of a specific useful kind, and he cannot do work of a useful kind without employing products as the means of production of a new product, and thereby transferring their value to the new product. The property, therefore, which labor power in action, living labor, possesses of preserving value at the same time that it adds it, is a gift of nature which costs the worker nothing, but is very advantageous to the capitalist since it preserves the existing value of his capital. As long as trade is good, the capitalist is too absorbed in making profits to take notice of this gratuitous gift of labor. Violent interruptions of the labor process, crises, make him painfully aware of it. As regards the means of production, what is really consumed is their use value, and the consumption of this value by labor results in the product. There is in fact no consumption of their value, and it would therefore be inaccurate to say that it is reproduced. It is rather preserved, not by reason of any operation it itself undergoes in the labor process, but because the use values, in which it originally existed, vanishes, although when it vanishes it does so into another use value. Hence, the value of the means of production reappears in the value of the product, but it is not, strictly speaking, reproduced in that value. What is produced is a new use value in which the old exchange value reappears. It is otherwise with the subjective factor of the labor process, labor power, which sets itself in motion independently. While labor, because it is directed to a specific purpose, preserves and transfers to the product the value of the means of production, at the same time, throughout every instant it is in motion, it is creating an additional value, a new value. Suppose the process of production breaks off, just when the worker has produced an equivalent for the value of his own labor power, when, for example, by 6 hours of labor he has added the value of 3 shillings. This value is the excess of the total value of the product over the portion of its value contributed by the means of production. It is the only original value formed during this process, the only portion of the value of the product created by the process itself. Of course, we do not forget that this new value only replaces the money advanced by the capitalist in purchasing labor power, and spent by the worker on means of subsistence. With regard to the 3 shillings which have been expended, the new value of 3 shillings appears merely as a reproduction. Nevertheless, it is a real reproduction, and not, as in the case of the value of the means of production, simply an apparent one. The replacement of one value by another is here brought about by the creation of new value. We know, however, from what has gone before, that the labor process may continue beyond the time necessary to reproduce and incorporate in the product a mere equivalent for the value of the labor power. For this, 6 hours alone would be sufficient, but the process lasts longer, say for 12 hours. The activity of labor power, therefore, not only reproduces its own value, but produces value over and above this. This surplus value is the difference between the value of the product and the value of the elements consumed in the formation of the product, in other words, the means of production and the labor power. In presenting the different parts played by the various factors of the labor process in the formation of the product's value, we have in fact characterized the different functions allotted to the different elements of capital in its own valorization process. The excess of the total value of the product over the sum of the values of its constituent elements is the excess of the capital which has been valorized over the value of the capital originally advanced. The means of production on the one hand, labor power on the other, are merely the different forms of existence which the value of the original capital assumed when it lost its monetary form and was transformed into the various factors of the labor process. That part of capital, therefore, which is turned into means of production, i.e. the raw material, the auxiliary material, and the instruments of labor, does not undergo any quantitative alteration of value in the process of production. For this reason, I call it the constant part of capital, or more briefly, constant capital. On the other hand, that part of capital which is turned into labor power does undergo an alteration of value in the process of production. It both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and produces an excess, a surplus value, which may itself vary and be more or less according to circumstances. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it the variable part of capital, or more briefly, variable capital. The same elements of capital which, from the point of view of the labor process, can be distinguished respectively as the objective and subjective factors, as means of production and labor power, can be distinguished, from the point of view of the valorization process, as constant and variable capital. The definition of constant capital given above by no means excludes the possibility of a change of value in its elements. Suppose that the price of cotton in one day is 6 pence a pound, and the next day, as a result of the failure of the cotton crop, a shilling a pound. Each pound of the cotton bought at 6 pence and worked up after the rise in value transfers to the product a value of 1 shilling, and the cotton already spun before the rise and perhaps circulating in the market as yarn similarly transfers to the product twice its original value. It is plain, however, that these changes of value are independent of the valorization of the cotton in the spinning process itself. If the old cotton had never been spun, it could be resold at a shilling a pound after the rise, instead of at 6 pence. Further, the fewer the processes the cotton has gone through, the more certain is this result. We therefore find that speculators make it a rule, when such sudden changes in value occur, to speculate in the raw material in its least worked-up form, to speculate therefore in yarn rather than in cloth, and indeed in cotton itself rather than in yarn. The change of value in the case we have been considering originates not in the process in which the cotton plays the part of a means of production, and in which it therefore functions as constant capital, but in the process in which the cotton itself is produced. The value of a commodity is certainly determined by the quantity of labor contained in it, but this quantity is itself socially determined. If the amount of labor time socially necessary for the production of any commodity alters, and a given weight of cotton represents more labor after a bad harvest than after a good one, this reacts back on all the old commodities of the same type, because they are only individuals of the same species, and their value at any given time is measured by the labor socially necessary to produce them, i.e. by the labor necessary under the social conditions existing at the time. As the value of the raw material may change, so too may that of the instruments of labor, machinery, etc. employed in the process, and consequently, that portion of the value of the product transferred to it from them may also change. If, as a result of new invention, machinery of a particular kind can be produced with a lessened expenditure of labor, the old machinery undergoes a certain amount of depreciation, and therefore transfers proportionately less value to the product. But here too, the change in value originates outside the process in which the machine is acting as a means of production. Once engaged in this process, the machine cannot transfer more value than it possesses independently of the process. Just as the change in the value of the means of production, even after they have begun to take part in the labor process, does not alter their character as constant capital, so too a change in the proportion of constant to variable capital does not affect the distinction in their functions. The technical conditions of the labor process may be revolutionized to such an extent that, where formerly 10 men using 10 implements of small value worked a relatively small quantity of raw material, one man may now, with the aid of one expensive machine, work up 100 times as much raw material. In the latter case, we have an enormous increase in the constant capital, i.e. the total value of the means of production employed, and at the same time a great reduction in the variable part of the capital, which has been laid out on labor power. This change, however, alters only the quantitative relation between the constant and the variable capital, or the proportion in which the total capital is split up into its constant and variable constituents. It has not in the least degree affected the essential difference between the two.